Martin,
Here.
Hannaford,
Here.
Sherman,
Here.
Wallace,
Here.
Winters,
Here.
Hamilton,
Here.
Eckhart,
Here.
Stelling.
Here.
All right, item 4 on the agenda is public hearing on annual fiscal year 2020-2021 annual budget. As required by law, we are having this public hearing to get feedback from the community as far as the budget for the upcoming year. We'll tell you that the staff and the finance committee have worked a lot to get this budget to this point. The department heads as well, and we have included quite a bit of changes from previous year's budgets. So with that, I'm going to let Angelica explain the budget, and then we'll have comment.
I'm just going to walk everyone through revenues and expenses for each of the funds. So if we look at the general fund, we are anticipating about $5.565 million in revenue. That includes sales tax. Sales tax, which is the largest factor of that. A couple of things that I'd like to point out. When you're looking at the year-to-year comparison, you'll see that we've discussed budgeting flat sales tax revenues. If you look at the year-to-year comparison, it looks like we're actually budgeting a decrease. Our auditors have this year, they asked us to change the way that we are allocating sales tax revenue. And so prior to this year, we would bring our sales tax revenue into the general fund and transfer the money to the hospital authority, and then transfer the money to the rec center, and transfer the money to the scholarship fund. They have asked us to change that method, and when we bring the sales tax in, only the portion that is going to stay in the general fund, as well as the hospital authority money, goes into the general fund. We then transfer the hospital authority money out. But as far as the rec center and the scholarship fund, those sales tax monies will go directly to those funds, as opposed to coming into the general fund and transferring them out. So if you look at our transfers out on the expenditure side, you'll see a reduction in expense there for the general fund. So it all washes out at the end of the day. We're anticipating total sales tax revenue for general fund and the AEDA is about $4.7 million, which is flat with where we are this year currently. So I just wanted to point that out because it does look a little bit deceiving. I think I got some hopes up when we saw that, and just wanted to make sure I explained it so there was no question there. A couple of other things I'd like to point out for our revenue in the general fund. We have approximately a $60,000 decrease in tax revenue because we're still negotiating our ONG franchise. And so last year, well, not this year, but previously, we received about $55,000 to $60,000 a year. So that money has been removed. So if we do get that franchise negotiated, that would be revenue that we weren't budgeting for. So it would be adding to that surplus, essentially. Another part that we have looked at is ambulance revenue is increased. We are working to try to find a different billing company. So in hopes that that revenue will increase by changing our billing company. Talking with Julie and Bridget, I feel like the number that we budgeted is a fairly reasonable expectation. So we'll hope to get that change made quickly and we can move forward there. So that is the basic revenue for the general fund. If we look at the enterprise fund or the AUA utility authority fund, we are budgeting for the final rate increase of the 4-year rate increase that we implemented in 2017. This will be the last year that we have an automatic rate increase. We are, however, still anticipating that we're going to have a decrease in revenue from this year based on our current number of utility customers and their 12 months of prior usage. Even with the rate increase, we still anticipate that that number is going to be lower than what we budgeted for this year. So,
To clarify, this won't be the last year for an automatic increase. It just changes from what we prescribed 4 years ago to the CPI.
yes, you're correct. As far as the 10% increase that we had. Thank you. Another thing to point out there is we have revenue for the CDBG grant that we applied for. We have not heard back on that CDBG grant. I do know that they've extended that deadline with COVID-19. They pushed that deadline out a little bit. So they're still taking applications for that grant, so we probably will not hear back on that grant till later once our fiscal year is started. So if we would not receive that revenue, would not receive that grant, the capital improvement projects that we have planned with that money would then be taken out of the budget. If we look at special revenue funds, which are the donation fund, the hotel motel tax fund, airport fund, cemetery, street and alley fund, and the municipal court fund, we've done a variety of different things here. The donation fund, if you look at it, we have an increased amount of expected revenue there, mostly because the Kids and Cops organization is working to raise money for a scholarship that they're working on, and so that being said, we anticipate that we're going to have a larger amount of donations coming into that fund. If that money doesn't come in, obviously there would not be any corresponding expenses spent there, so just kind of our best estimate based on what they've raised so far year to date. Hotel motel tax, we have estimated revenues consistent with our fiscal year 16-17, which was the lowest revenue that we've had in 5 years, and so it's down quite a bit from what we've budgeted this year and even from what we've received this year, so obviously that's subject to fluctuate. For the airport fund, so with the airport fund, the oil revenue that they have, we have budgeted obviously a lesser amount than what we have in this year because of the oil price. And so that revenue is down a little bit. They do have some grant revenue in there for an FAA grant that they should be receiving, about $665,000 there, and then an additional $30,000 in CARES grant funding the airport received. We expect to see that money come in next year as well. So the revenue, even though we've actually budgeted the revenue to be down, if you look there because of the grant money coming in, it looks like it's a higher budget. Cemetery is budgeted for approximately $77,000, which is a little bit higher than what we've expended this year, but it's consistent with last year's revenue that we budgeted. Obviously, if there's less money spent, we'll have to transfer less money in to cover expenses in the cemetery fund. That fund is not the revenue doesn't cover the expenses there. We have to transfer money out of the general fund. Street and alley fund, the biggest portion of that is the $5 fee for street maintenance that we have on water bills. So that fee there is about $132,000 of the $180,000. We have motor vehicle and gas excise tax that will add to that revenue as well. And municipal court fund, we typically don't have a lot of revenue in there. If we do, it's generally interest off of CDs. And I think that I don't know that we have any CDs for that particular fund at this time. So, capital project funds, that's our APD drug fund, cemetery beautification fund, an OWRB construction fund, an airport grant fund. Most of those funds are inactive at this particular point in time, so we don't have any revenue budget there. Our proprietary funds, predominantly made up of the AEDA fund, which is the scholarship fund in the rec center. We are anticipating about $1.25 million there in revenue, and that's based on sales tax. We do know for the rec center we have some revenue budgeted there in addition to the sales tax, but we've been fairly conservative with our estimates there, not knowing what the fall and spring are going to look like for next year. That is a summary of revenue. Do you guys have any questions on revenue before we move to expenses? No? I'm really going to talk about expenses as a whole because predominantly what we've done, there's a few funds that are a little bit different, but as a whole, we've taken the same mentality to budget across the city for expenses. I know in weeks past, Mayor Parker has talked about that we are using fiscal year 16-17 as our benchmark for expenses. The revenue that we received in that year was the lowest year that we've received in the last 5 years, and so we're hoping to use that as our guide for expenses to try to create a surplus for the year. So some of the things that we've done To do that, we are currently keeping all staffing levels as is. If there are open positions, we're not currently filling those. The only exception would be, we've talked a lot about EMS lately. We're working to hire some part-time staff members there so that we can cut back on our overtime for our full-time staff members. So I think that is two-sided. We'll see an increase in some personnel, but it should decrease our overall overtime. And the personnel we hire in obviously will be at a lesser rate than the overtime rate. Let's see, we have put a freeze on all travel and training for next year. That's an area that no one's excited about, but it allows us to cut some additional money out of the budget. And if we can find some grants to do traveling or to do training with, we'll work to utilize that methodology. Or if there's some training that must be done, the department heads are going to have to work within their budget to find that money. Capital improvements, the only capital improvements that we're doing are grant funded or fee funded. So if you look at the capital improvement page, you'll see that we have included in there our street repairs. Well, all of that is funded by our $5 fee or our motor vehicle and gas excise tax. So the other big pieces are the airport grant that we talked about and the CDBG grant that we talked about. If those things are not grant funded or loan revenue funded, we won't be doing them. The only other thing that you really see on here is our donation fund. We consider that in our capital outlay simply because it's the easiest way to track that. And so you can see we are only going to be spending what we raised this year. So our budget for our donation fund is exactly what our revenue is. So if the revenue doesn't come in, we won't be spending that money. So also, as a whole, our department heads will have to look at their budget each and every month as our sales tax revenue or our utility revenue comes in. For some of our smaller funds, as their revenue comes in, they're going to have to look at what that month looks like. And so if our sales tax revenue comes in 10% less than what we've budgeted, we're going to have to take our monthly revenue for that particular month and cut that back by 10% and adjust our expenses. Knowing that, our biggest pieces of that are personnel expenses, and so those are going to be the same and constant no matter what our sales tax does. So it's going to be a definite change in thought process for the employees where we'll have to do a better job at communicating that information to them so that they can make adjustments and working with staff to make sure they understand how all that will factor in. I guess just to break down a couple of the big expenses, personnel expense is our largest expense. For the entire city, that's approximately $4.2 million. So when you start looking at our overall budget for the city, that's the biggest chunk by far. The other piece is the capital improvement. That's a very large chunk, but once again, if those grants don't come in or we don't receive that money, those projects won't be done. So I can talk more specifically about some of the expenses if you would like by fund, but our mentality as a whole is going to be the same.
Well, I guess at this time, because this is a public hearing, we'll open it up to the public if you have any questions or comments about the budget or suggestions.
Real quick, if I may, just one thing that stuck out to me on the expenditures. In general, everything is pretty in line. There's two things that stick out. Administration being $1 million below 1920 estimated, and then parks and building being about half what it has been in the previous years. Can you explain those a little bit further?
A biggest part of the administration is the transfers that I talked about, the transfers out to the AEDA and the scholarship funds. Since we're taking that revenue directly to those accounts as opposed to transferring out, that is probably the biggest portion there.
Okay.
And then parks and building maintenance, we don't have anything budgeted for swimming pools.
Okay.
So that being said, that's a huge expense that if pool is in fact able to open, we'll have to look at how we fund that next year.
Okay.
Anybody have anything about the budget?
next meeting.
I just want to thank the finance committee for working so hard on this,
Angelica, the committee, the department heads, they've all
all of us.
worked very hard to get the budget prepared. Yes, I echo that.
Yes.
The department heads have worked a lot
Yes.
more than they have in years past, and so I really appreciate all that.
Very nice.
All right, item 5 is discussion and action to enter into executive session pursuant to A 25 OS 307B1 to discuss the employment, hiring, and appointment of city business manager, and B 25 OS 307B2 to discuss contract negotiations with IAFF Local 3782, Alva, Oklahoma.
I'll motion to enter into executive session. Second.
Have a motion by Mr. Winters and a second by Mr. Sherman to enter into executive session for the city business manager discussions and the firefighter union discussions. Is there any further discussion? Please call the vote.
Winters,
Yes.
Sherman,
Yes.
Eckhart,
Yes.
Hamilton,
Yes.
Stelling,
Yes.
Wallace,
Yes.
Hannaford,
Yes.
Martin.
Yes.
All right. We'll ask the